Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Edward Byrne, the principal here at King's College London. It's a great privilege to welcome you all here tonight for what is a really special occasion, the Global Peace Index 2015 London launch. I'll say a word more about Steve Killelea in a minute, but it's wonderful to have Steve here. After I've finished this very brief introduction, Steve will speak and will unveil the 2015 Global Peace Index, and of course you have a copy on your seat. Following this, Peter Apps, Reuters correspondent, will moderate an interdisciplinary panel of experts, which includes Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies, and Lieutenant General Jonathon Riley, who is also an adjunct professor in the department at King's. And we'll then have a Q&A aiming to finish around 8 o'clock for a reception that we hope many of you will stay for. So look, let me just say a word about Steve Killelea. I had the privilege of meeting Steve in my last job when I was the president of a large Australian university called Monash. Steve came to see me to discuss how we might collaborate in the increasingly important area of peace studies. And I came to understand his passion and indeed his vision. His background is as an entrepreneur in the IT area, but very rapidly he became increasingly interested in global issues and established a foundation which had a major benevolent impact in a number of areas. He's a very thoughtful person, and he told me that while on holiday in a remote area about 10 years ago, he was thinking about the dreadful state of nations around the world, how some did so much better than others, and with his background, would it be a good thing to try to quantify that? So he sought advice. He visited places like The Economist, and he built up gradually a body of knowledge that provided a basis for a quantitative global peace index based on wars, degree of militarization of society, and a series of indications around a peaceful and stable and nurturing society, and hence the Global Peace Index was born. It's now in its 9th year. It's become increasingly influential around the world and is one of the tools used by many organizations in terms of working out how to make things better, which of course is what Steve himself is all about. So Steve is a pioneer. He's devoted much of his own energy and resource in every way over recent years to improving global peace. One of the major contributions to the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is founded, has of course been the Global Peace Index, and it's a huge privilege that Steve has come to London to launch it at King's College. Please welcome Steve Killelea.
Thank you for those kind words, Ed. Now, you may hear a little bit of raspiness in my voice. It may even drop off a little bit. I've had a slight cold and I've been talking continuously for 2 days. But this presentation, even with a bad voice, is going to be easy after doing live simultaneous television interviews with the BBC. So, thank you for all attending. So we look at the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's been set up to study the intersections between business, peace and economics, places special emphasis on measuring peace, and then ascribing an economic value to changes in that peace, and then also using empirical, in this case statistical analysis, to determine the attitudes, institutions and structures which are associated with highly peaceful societies. Today we have offices in Sydney, New York, Mexico, and are expanding, and we'll probably be setting offices up in Europe within the next 6 months. So if we look at the structure of the Global Peace Index, it's now in its 9th year. And we can take the work back 8 years for doing trend analysis. It ranks 162 countries around the world. That covers 99.6% of the population of the world. And it rates them according to their relative states of peace. We use 23 indicators. Those indicators are on a scale of 1 to 5. Some of them are quantitative, some of them are qualitative. And the approach, the methodology has been developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace. We also develop 4 of the indicators. But we have an expert panel which tells us what indicators we should use and what the weighing of those indicators should be. So and then what we do is for the Economist Intelligence Unit, we get them to compile the index. Now, what that makes is for a very rigorous approach to developing the index, because we set the methodology. We've got an expert panel which sets out what we should be measuring, which indicators to use, and the weighings, and then we have a separate group which compiles the index. And that tripartite arrangement makes for quite a rigorous product in the end. So if we look at the indicators which we use in the index, there are 3 different domains. The first is measures the ongoing domestic and international conflict, 6 indicators there. We have 10 measures of societal safety and security, so the measures internally within a country. So they're things like homicide rates, violent crime, number of people who are incarcerated, level of terrorism, and a number of police per 100,000 population, availability of small arms. And that part of the index has the largest weighing. It's got about 60% of the weighing within the index. And then we've got 7 measures of militarisation which we use as well. And that'd be the percentage of GDP spent on the military, number of battlefield deaths, number of conflicts of countries involved in imports, exports and sophistication of the military. So we'll very quickly move through the highlights from this year, and then I'm going to move into a concept called positive peace, because I think that is probably the most transformational concept coming out of the work we're doing. So if we look at it, the average peacefulness in the last 12 months has remained about the same, which seems quite surprising when we look at the mayhem happening in the Middle East at the moment, or in Nigeria, Cameroon and Niger. But what we're looking at is 2 opposite ends. The countries which are most peaceful are becoming more peaceful, the countries which are least peaceful are becoming less peaceful. And this is quite an interesting trend, and what we'd call the inequality in peace. So if we look over the last 12 months, 81 countries actually improved in peacefulness, 78 decreased in peacefulness. So if we look at the last 12 months, the deteriorations, none of these will come as any surprise, maybe other than the last one. Death through internal conflict, increases in terrorist activity, but there's been a drop-off in UN funding. That actually runs contrary to an 8-year trend where countries have been better at paying their dues for their peacekeeping operations. So I think maybe it's a blip rather than its actual ongoing trend. And then if we look at the counteractions of that, the ones which improved, we've got homicide rates, we've got number of external conflicts fought, and that's the winding down for many countries out of Afghanistan, and also the wind down of the US, its allies out of Iraq. But that's been offset by increases in internal conflict, and political stability has also improved over the last 12 months as well. Syria is the least peaceful country in the world. That's followed by Iraq, followed by Afghanistan. Iceland is the most peaceful country in the world, followed by Denmark, then Austria. Most improved 2 countries are both in the African subcontinent. They're Guinea-Bissau and Côte d'Ivoire. Guinea-Bissau's had a slow improvement in peace now over 8 years. Côte d'Ivoire, it's on the back of coming out of a conflict. Last year, the country which improved the most was Georgia. We quite often see that where there's cataclysmic falls, sometimes you get very steep rises back. They rarely, however, come back to where they were. It takes a long time to actually get the peacefulness fully back after a conflict. The largest drop in the last years doesn't come as any surprise, Libya and the Ukraine. So in 2014, 6,000 people were killed in the Ukraine. But what a lot of you may not realise, there's over 1 million people there now displaced, which I'll come to later. Europe improves in peace. Europe now is at historic levels of peace, and this is truly quite remarkable. So if you went back 100 years with homicide rates, a number of European countries, it's never been lower. They'd be places like Italy, France, Italy, France, and Germany. Similarly, when you look at the percentage of GDP spent on the military over the last 50 years, there's been substantial drops there. In some cases, it's 40% of what it was 50 years ago. And obviously, Europe is the most peaceful region in the world. If we look at the Middle East and North Africa, it's now the least peaceful region in the world. That's for the first time. It was the fourth least peaceful region in the world 8 years ago, so it gives you an idea of the dramatic drop there. If we look at just the length of the size of the change, if we look at the homicide rate, for example, biggest change there, and I'll come to that in a little bit later on, number of external conflicts fought, and then political instability, it's improved. Likelihood of demonstrations has dropped as well. Improvements in relationships with neighbouring states on average and level of violent crime. So with a lot of these stats, you'll find them bounce around over a year. So some of these will be contradictory to the 8-year trends. But this is what happened last year. UN peacekeeping funding has dropped off by many nations. Deaths from internal conflict, that doesn't come as any surprises, up. 180,000 globally in 2014. Went back to 2010, it was 49,000. So that's a 3.5 times increase, which is really quite remarkable. Impact of terrorism, that's again come up, and I'll come on to that further. The political terror scale, that counts the gross human rights abuses by the state against its citizens. It's calculated using US State Department reports and Amnesty International. So this is a mud map of the world. Blue being really good, red being really bad. And so you can see that there's hot spots of peace and hot spots of violence in different parts of the world, and then medium levels of peace in other parts of the world. You'll note Western Europe is high in peace. So if we look at the most peaceful nations in the world, we start with Iceland, we go to Denmark, Austria, New Zealand, Switzerland. If we go at the other end of the scale, what we'll find at the bottom end is Syria, followed by Iraq, followed by Afghanistan, followed by Sudan, and then Central African Republic. So we look at the 8-year trends. So if we look over the 8-year trends, peace is recorded a slight decrease. And this is using a country average technique. So that's 2.4% deterioration over the 8 years. So if we look at the different domains, which I mentioned earlier on, safety and security is deteriorated by 3.8%. We'll find militarisation is improved by 2.4%. That's largely on the pullout from Afghanistan, Iraq, so less countries involved in conflicts, and decreases in the percentage of GDP spent on the military. And if we're looking at ongoing conflicts, that's deteriorated over that period of time by 0.86%. So the largest deteriorations are deaths from internal conflict over the 8 years and the impact of terrorism, and I'll come to that further on. 78 countries improved over this period of time, 86 countries decreased. And again, so looking at the aggregate of it all, it's very different when you look at the detail. So quite often to really understand this stuff, you need to look at the detail within the region and also a country, the way it moves relative to other countries, the way it moves even relative to its region. So the greatest deteriorations were in Middle East and North Africa and Central America and the Caribbean. Very different reasons for the two. Middle East and North Africa we all understand, but it's really homicides and violent crime in Central America and the Caribbean regions. Many, as I mentioned earlier on, many countries are now at historical levels of high. If we look at the internal and external peace scores, you see the changes and the differences here. You'll note that in 2009, you've had the peak for external peace. At that stage, we started to see the pullouts from Iraq and then moving into Afghanistan. We've also, just after the financial crisis, global financial crisis, where we saw budgetary restraints start to affect military budgets. And we can see internal peace deteriorated, but over the last 2 years, it's held fairly static. Now, if we look at the different indicators, we'll note that external conflicts have decreased. UN peacekeeping funding has been very good. It's improved dramatically other than the last year. And it's too early to determine whether that's a change, a trend, or just a blip. If we look at the other side, we find refugees and IDPs, internal conflict deaths, and the impact of terrorism, the ones which have deteriorated the most over the last 8 years. Death from terrorism, you'll note between 2012 and 2013, massive increase. So it was about 64%. So the last 12 months it's increased 9%, from 18,000 deaths up to 20. But most of that doesn't appear to be in the Middle East. It's stayed about the same. The growth in terrorism has actually occurred in West Africa, in Nigeria, where in Baba, 2,000 people were killed in one terrorist attack. That was the largest since 9/11. Then the spillover into Cameroon and Niger. So Cameroon in 2013 had no deaths, 2014, 191. Also, we found that in 2013, 60 countries suffered death from terrorism. In 2014, that increased to 69. So we can see that, and I think everyone here is aware of it, number of refugees now are at historical highs. So there's over, probably closer to 60 million as I'm speaking now, but as we've done the figures, these for 2013, they were at about 36 million then. 50 million would have been as the estimates at the end of 2014. So just to put that in perspective, that's 1 in every 133 people on the planet. And Syria is probably the one which suffers the most from it. Last census, there are approximately 22 million people in the country. If we look at it today, somewhere between 9 and 14 million of those people are displaced. And it's having significant impact on the regions, on the countries around it. We're also now starting to see the impact it's having in Europe. So we look at the global homicide rates. They've climbed over the period we've been doing it, but the last 2 years they're down. So we think a lot of that's done with statistical reassessment by UNODC of the methodologies and which they're using. So we'll be watching this figure closely over time. If we look at the increases in urbanisation, there's two ways you can argue that. Over the longer term, it'll create more peace, or the movement to the cities will create more violence. And I haven't got time to go into the detail of that, but there's a very interesting analysis in the GPI report, which I recommend everyone to read. So if we look at the cost of violence, we've got a methodology here which we use to calculate the cost of violence globally. So it came in at $14 trillion in 2014. That's just over 13% of global GDP. These figures, in my estimate, are conservative because we only count where there are numbers and figures which we can use, and there's many types and forms of violence and costs associated with the protection of violence which we can't count. So we do the individual estimates for 162 countries. That's 99.6% of the world. This allows for cost-benefit analysis on where different interactions might work. If you've got drops in peace, you can also calculate the number of people who may fall under, let's say, $1.25 a day. And we've got 15 different dimensions which we use to measure it. And if we look over the last 8 years, it's gone up by 15.3%. One of the more interesting things that related to that is that's roughly about the same size that the global economy has increased over the last 8 years as well. So as businesses, they're increasing at about the same size as the global economy. So this is a map to break up the different sizes, and this is really quite interesting. So we go up in the far top left-hand corner, you'll see UN peacekeeping. That accounts for 0.17% of the total amount of money spent dealing with violence or protecting oneself against the cost of violence and the lost economic benefits from it. You'll notice the military's largest, that's at 43%. But the military is one of the things you can count well because there's great databases on it. So if we had other forms of violence which were in there, I think we'd see that shrink. Crime and interpersonal, you can see conflict as well. One of the things you'll find in the centre, in the blue, right at the very, very top, is the small arms trade. Very, very tiny when you look at it, but that is the legitimate small arms trade because we can count that. We can't count the illegitimate small arms trade. So I'm going to move into positive peace now. Positive peace are the attitude, institutions and structures which create or sustain peaceful societies. Now, for me, I think this is probably the most transformational part of the work which we're doing. And that's because it changes the lens from studying what's not working to studying what is working. You can do analogies to health. So very important to understand pathology and stop disease. It's a bit like you're trying to stop violence. But it wasn't until we studied healthy people that we learnt that right exercise, good mental disposition and correct diet's what kept us healthy. We'd never learn that through analysing people on their deathbeds, would we? It's a bit like you. If you wanted to have a good marriage, would you hang around the divorce courts to work out how? So the study of peaceful societies gives you a whole different lens on what actually you've got to create resilience within societies. So this is our approach. This is totally empiric, and we use statistical techniques to work. And this really does reframe the study of peace towards what works. That's really transformational in my opinion. We also find that positive peace is a very good measure of societal resilience. Societies which are high in positive peace tend to be able to absorb shocks and adjust much more quickly. And positive peace leads to other things which we think are important as well. So there's a whole range of other things when societies are strong in peace, which we all here think are worthwhile, which are also engendered by having these structures in place. So how do we arrive at positive peace? Seeing we've got the Global Peace Index, it uses the absence of violence or fear of violence as the definition of peace. It gives us a statistical base over 162 countries, which is a solid enough base to do statistical analysis. As we've got it over 8 years, it's quite a decent data set. We've now analysed other data sets, indexes and attitudinal surveys to find out what's most statistically significantly connected with that. That gives us the ability to produce a positive peace index, and then through the comparison of the global peace index and a positive peace index, all sorts of dynamics which you can pull out of it, which can help you with understanding risk, which I'll come to very soon. So we literally have been through over 8,500 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys. They cover macroeconomic, social relationships and attitudes, economic and social development indicators, economic and social integration indicators, the functioning of government and its structures, as well as external relations. So, again, the Positive Peace Index ranks 162 countries. It uses 24 indicators. That's 3 indicators for each of the domains in positive peace, which I'll hit in a minute. And each of those indicators, the ones which have got the strongest statistical significance when we do the analysis. We also then use the strength of the correlation for the weighing of each of those factors as well. So that means the construction of the index is none of our personal ideas on what creates a peaceful society. It's purely data-driven. And I think as a holistic approach, this is the only study of its type in the world which uses this type of empiric approach. So what are they? So they're well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relationships with neighbouring states, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a strong business environment. So these factors work as a system. So we've given up on causality, because as we study this, the causality on any of these functions can move in different directions depending on the situation. And I can give some graphic examples, but I haven't got time in this presentation. So we see it as a system, a systemic effect. And quite often what's important is not how strong the system is, it's the direction the system's moving in. Is it moving in a virtuous cycle, or is it moving in a vicious cycle? So if you can understand the momentum of the system, where it's moving, you've got the ability to have some understanding of its future likelihood. But if we look at positive peace, and what other outcomes does it drive? It drives higher GDP growth, which obviously links in with a strong business environment. The environments have lower inflation. They're more ecologically sound in their management. They have higher levels of human capital, which could be epitomised by education, but it's much more. They've got you've performed very, very well on various forms of human development indicators, such as gender equality or gender empowerment. Also perform very, very well on measures of well-being. So you could see these factors which create positive peace in many ways create an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. So, and if we look at positive peace globally, there's another mud map of it. Note the relationship you'll see with the map we had earlier on, which gave an idea of where's the most peaceful nations. You'll find very, very strong overlap in relationship, because one's derived from the other, and that's very, very important. So at the top, no surprises. Western democracies are very, very strong in this. Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Netherlands, Iceland, Austria, New Zealand, and finally, Australia. At the other end, you're not going to find any surprises either. Iran, Yemen, Equatorial Guinea, Southern Sudan, North Korea, Eritrea, Central African Republic, and our favourites, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Somalia. Now, what we did is looked at the positive peace and actual peace. So, in theory, what happens if the peace always moves back towards the mean of what the positive peace factors say a country should have. So, what we do is we looked at the countries which have a stronger measure of actual peace than their positive peace indicators say they should have. So in 2008, we picked the 30 countries with the highest differential between their actual peace and what their positive peace says they should have. So when we looked at that 7 years later, 4 of them had actually improved. Another 4 of them had stayed the same, but 22 of those 30 countries had actually dropped in peace. And therefore, this is a mechanism for risk analysis. Now, the good news, because you always got to have good news in a slide presentation. That's what I was always told. So if we look back over the last decade, 116 countries have actually improved in positive peace. 33 have decreased. But these increases in peace are only marginal, because we're looking at a positive peace environment. To change a system, it happens slowly over long periods of time. So we're looking at quite often decade changes for really, truly significant impact. This is quite an interesting diagram. It's complicated, so I could spend 20 minutes on this, but I'm only going to spend 1. What I want you to do is look into the lower left-hand corner. And what you'll see there is the 50 most peaceful nations. So the lines are the movements which they've had in peace over that period of time. And this talks to resilience. Once you get a certain level of positive peace, you've actually got the resilience to absorb shocks. Examples of this would be Iceland with the global financial crisis. It went bankrupt, but it's still #1 in the world. Japan, after the tsunami, it's still the 8th most peaceful in the world. So the resilience within the society can absorb shocks. Compare that to Greece with the global financial crisis. It's not at the bottom of positive peace, but it's much lower than most of the Western Europe. Or Haiti, after it had the cyclone go through. Now, this is a stunning slide. So, if we look at the countries which are high in positive peace, which is on the left-hand side, this is the number of civil resistance campaigns which have happened in countries with high levels of peace, medium levels of positive peace, and low levels of positive peace. Ones which are high in positive peace have less civil resistance movements. They're a lot less likely to be violent. The violent ones are in red, the non-violent ones are in blue. They exist for a shorter amount of time. They're usually got more limited in their aims, and they're more likely to partially achieve their aims. And Britain is an example of a high positive peace country, and you can see the way it's going about dealing with pulling out or not pulling out of the EU. You can also see the way it's dealing with the Scottish separatists. You look at Sudan as it pulled apart, and that was a country which is very, very low in positive peace. So what we can see is the adaptive qualities of countries which are highly peaceful. This is just a very simple example. It's looking at Myanmar. That's a country I've been spending some time in over the last 6 months, and will be spending more time in the next 6 months. And just with its positive peace factors over the last decade, how it compares to the global average. This just gives you a very, very simple example of how you can use this stuff to actually be able to do analysis. Now, in summary, if you can measure and analyse peace, you can understand the factors that create peace. If you can measure and analyse peace, you can work out the economic value of the lost opportunity of not having peace. And this, my friends, is actionable. It gives the ability to do better prediction, gives the ability to do better cost analysis, and also gives you better program outcomes. These are some of the other products we produce. I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but global terrorist indexes, country indexes, analysis on corruption, analysis on positive peace, and much more. And finally, if you're interested in exploring any of this, you can go to thevisionofhumanity.org, and got a website there, and it's got interactive maps which you can go in and look at any country, look at a whole range of different socio-economic factors, peace factors, and if any of you have got your mobiles out there and handy, you can tweet. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, hi. Can everyone hear me in the back? Hi, I'm Pete Apps. I'm Global Defence Correspondent at Reuters, and for the last 6 months I've been on sabbatical as Executive Director of an even newer, even more feral and new start think tank than the IEP, the Project for Study of the 21st Century, PS21. One of the reasons that I decided that I wanted to get out of the journalistic treadmill for a bit was I got the feeling that we were really missing the big picture, and I'll give you a good example of that. Earlier this year, PS21 took a look at the 20 bloodiest wars in the world in 2014, and we came up with the best data we could for their death tolls. And then we looked at the top 20 for 2013. There was a 28% increase between 1 year and the next. So between the end of 2013 and the end of 2014, the number of people killed in those conflicts went up, give or take 28%. What Steve's study shows you is that that misses the bigger picture. So there are, clearly, 10, 15, 25, 60, depending on how you measure it, countries where life has got a lot worse for people. And some of those conflicts bring with them much broader risk. Ukraine is a good example. The risk of a conflict between NATO and Russia has clearly gone up quite substantially because the wheels have come off in Ukraine. But most people don't live in those places, which is one of the reasons the people who do live there are trying to leave to go to them. What Steve's data shows is that there's some really much more complicated stuff out there, and the world is dividing not so much into the haves and have-nots, but the live in places where you'd want to live and bring up kids, and the live in places where you wouldn't. I think that brings some really interesting stuff, which I'm going to get the rest of the panel to talk about in a second. Firstly, you've got maybe 3/4 of the planet that is getting less good at violence. And violence is a skill, as I'm sure Lieutenant General Shaw will tell you shortly. How do the countries that are better engage with the countries that are not? Do we understand it? My formative experience was covering the civil war in Sri Lanka as a young 25-year-old reporter, where my eventual conclusion about the same time that I broke my neck in September 2006 was that we did not. Their understanding of how conflict worked was very different to that which would be taught even in staff colleges here. They looked at human rights and a variety of other things from a very different perspective. What Steve's done here is take a much deeper look beyond that. He's looked at the economics. I was emerging markets correspondent for a while. I really like the fact he does that. He's looking at granular data for different countries, and he's really digging into some of these trends, both on a macro level and on a smaller one. The biggest takeaway I have from covering Steve's index over the last half decade is the big trend since 2007-8. There has been a substantial decline in global peace over that period, and this is worrying. It's worrying because it means people are dying, but it's also worrying because it's broadly unusual. Stephen Pinker, Harvard University social psychologist, has done lots of work digging people up and looking at how likely they were to have been smashed around the head with a rock, and he has found that by and large people have died less violently, going back not just 50, 60 years to World War II, but going back longer. If that trend is inverted, that's a little bit worrying. But that's also well above my pay grade, so I'm glad to say I have an excellent panel of people who are much better qualified to discuss this. Lawrence Freedman probably needs very little introduction, one of the leading geopolitical thinkers of the last couple of decades. Lieutenant General Jonathon Shaw, former Deputy Commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan. I'm going to hand over to Lawrence now.
Thanks very much indeed, and you gave me my intro by mentioning Stephen Pinker. But first, congratulations, Steve, on a tremendous report. It is very helpful to have this information gathered together in this way. It allows us to do comparative work, to see trends over time, and while inevitably people will quibble with the data on particular measures, how they're applied in particular countries, it nonetheless will, because you can do it over time, because you can look at different countries on the same basis, it gives you that basis for comparison and to see trends. So what I want to do is take up the challenge that Peter has given us, which is, how does this compare with what we've been told by Stephen Pinker in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, that came out, it has to be said, before Syria, that promised, although he said that it wasn't predicting that we were entering what he called a new age of Aquarius, that the trends were nonetheless positive, that violence historically was on the decline, and that people now were far less likely to die violent deaths of any kind than had been the case in previous generations. And unfortunately, there is a number of precedents for people bringing out books to demonstrate that war is in the decline and becoming obsolescent, almost immediately to be followed by a deterioration in the international situation, which Norman Angel's The Great Illusion is probably, perhaps unfairly, the most famous, but Martin van Crevel's The Transformation of War that came out in 1990 is up there. So it's a very dangerous thing for peace to bring out a book predicting it. And one of the clear things that I think Pinker himself would recognize is that over the last couple of years, particularly because of Syria, battle deaths, which is the main measure that is used to chart the number of wars and the violence of wars, has gone up. But of course, Ukraine, which doesn't begin to compare with Syria in terms of the number of deaths, or with Iraq or many other conflicts, is nonetheless the one that also has made us tremendously uneasy for the reasons that were shown, that it's appeared in a place where we thought we'd cracked the problem of peace, and it turns out that we haven't. Now, Pinker offers explanations for what he believes the trend, and they fit in pretty broadly with what this index describes as positive peace. Essentially, if only everybody could become more liberal and like us, then the world would be a better and peaceful place. And of course, it's hard to disagree with that. And Pinker, in referring to our better angels of our nature in comparison with our inner demons, is hoping, essentially, trying to chart the extent to which we've become more civilized. But there's another aspect to peace, which is a geopolitical explanation of peace. Not just that we've become more civilized, though hopefully that does reinforce it and helps to explain a lot of the aspects of violence that are covered in these reports, of criminality and homicides and so on. But geopolitical factors are relevant. Pinker, for example, will not accept, he denies vehemently the possibility that nuclear deterrence may have played a role in what is now known as the long peace that began in 1945 and more or less continues to this day. And one can obviously have grave misgivings about the fact that nuclear weapons still play a role in international politics. But one can have those misgivings and still recognize, fortunately, that it has also produced a degree of prudence at times of international crisis. And if we come back to Ukraine, I think one of the things, fortunately, the index comes with proper explanations of why violence has increased and decreased. If we took another index, the Transparency Index, which measures corruption, you would look at Ukraine and you would notice that it's had an improvement on corruption, as one would hope, because it's thrown out the kleptocratic president, Yanukovych, and the Transparency Index looked at more countries, but Ukraine a few years ago was on 144. Russia was a mere 122. Now, Ukraine has improved its position. And when you look at that, it's telling you something about Ukraine and its politics and its economics and what they're trying to do in that country. If you look at this and you see that the Ukrainian position has deteriorated, it's not its fault. It hasn't deteriorated because Ukrainians became worse people. It's deteriorated because Russia is supporting an invasion, has invaded effectively Ukraine, and this is acknowledged in the report. And therefore, if we're going to deal with that problem, I actually think it is important to strengthen the institutions and the economy and so on of Ukraine, but you've also got to address the geopolitical factors as well. The other point I'll make, and then I will stop, is that this work also does reinforce what I still think is one of the simplest and most, in some ways, depressing insights about conflict, which was that produced by Paul Collier for the World Bank a number of years ago, which is the best indicator of future conflict is past conflict. By and large, where it's happened before, it may well happen again. And the challenge is, which is how Paul Collier raised it, is how do you break out of that cycle? And work that has been done on that will stress, as this report does, the positive things, the institution buildings, the economic reform, working out relations with neighbours, but it will also stress the importance of international support. And one of the things that one has to recognise is that, and this perhaps is reflected in your numbers on peacekeeping, is that we've now reached a point where the readiness of the international community as a whole to intervene and to engage with countries in crisis has declined. And that decline means that it may well be harder for countries to get out of these cycles of violence which is what leads to these depressing numbers, and to the same countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Somalia and so on appearing year after year, leaving aside countries where there appeared to be some reason to hope that they could survive conflict and escape it, such as Syria, but that are now back in it. So my conclusion is to once again congratulate Steve on extraordinarily useful body of information, to reinforce the view that the positive peace index refers to things that can help, but keep in mind that conflict has political causes as well, and that and it's these political causes that we also need to address if we're going to see improvements and a reversal of some of these depressing trends in the future. Thank you very much.
As a practitioner, what matters from a report like this is that having measured the data, and measuring the data is a great source of congratulations, Laurie said, is what we then do with it. My first observation is that a report like this should give us some advance warning of where, when, and how interventions may be required. Now, intervention in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan is not a popular topic, as Professor Freedman has indicated. But no matter how unpopular, there may well be occasions when it is necessary and right. Such occasions can occur when vital national or alliance interests are at stake. They might be in support of a UN mandate. They might be because of a humanitarian disaster that is so compelling that it cannot be ignored. Thus, interventions may be wholly humanitarian or humanitarian with military support. They might involve direct action, either through land-air operations or maritime air. They might enable local forces through training and equipment support. The humanitarian disasters to which this report points us are not things like Ebola, even though that required a military component, but those that result from violence. And the mass movement of people from ISIS-dominated areas of Iraq and Syria is a prime example. It is a fact that it is only military forces that have standing command, control, and logistic capabilities, transportation and manpower, which is not routinely committed and is therefore able to respond in emergency at short notice. Now, a report like this should enable prudent contingency planning and force generation, and thus reduce the likelihood of our being surprised. Throughout my service, MOD, PGHQ, NATO have maintained numbers of contingency plans which were regularly updated. There were staff officers who did nothing but, and this report must be a valuable tool in that process. I have to admit that I remain sceptical that increases in the deployment of UN peacekeeping missions, or indeed decreases, including those by regional bodies mandated by the UN, are a safe measure of peacefulness. The understanding and the practice of peacekeeping have changed over the past decade and still are changing. It has no doubt become more robust, but it needed to. It's still largely based on consent, and consent is a relative concept, not an absolute. It may be present in one place, but not in another, within the same theatre of operations. It may be present at high level, but absent on the ground, where parties will manoeuvre to advantage whenever they can. Too often during my service, peacekeeping has merely frozen or suspended a conflict, giving the appearance of peacefulness rather than the reality, addressing the symptoms, not the causes. Now, I'm not suggesting that freezing a conflict is necessarily a bad thing, just that it's not always a safe metric. Similarly, in the matter of intervention, I was interested in the discussion on positive peace, in the analysis of situations where resistance campaigns, insurgencies if you like, employ violence to achieve their aims or force compromise. The length of the struggle in these situations can be determined by how much violence they, and indeed a government response, is prepared to apply. And this in turn depends on the degree to which either or both is prepared to compromise. An intervention is likely therefore to be the most successful where this overlap, this willingness to compromise, can be identified. And again, a report like this should help us to do that. Now, health warning. Order may give the appearance of peacefulness, but order is not the same thing as security. The Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Shiite militias in Iraq, even the RUF in Sierra Leone or the IRA in Northern Ireland, all brought order, the appearance of peace and quiet, so long as people conformed to their notions of behavior. However, very few people in those situations could be thought of as being secure, especially minorities and women. The examples I gave perhaps are extreme, but one can, I believe, think of parts of the world where this is certainly true. I also would like to urge you to develop the notion of granularity, which you mentioned, and to develop it below the level of country. Some countries are small, but many unpeaceful countries are enormous, and conditions in countries where peace is lacking vary massively. In Afghanistan, conditions in the north were totally different from those in the south and east. True, the north had its problems with criminality and warlordism, but the scale of violence in the areas affected by Pashtun insurgency and Al-Qaeda-sponsored terrorism was of a totally different order, requiring a totally different level of response. Moreover, this problem did not respect the national boundaries which define this study. The insurgency, as much Pashtun as is Islamic, saw no distinction between the northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan and the border provinces of Afghanistan, other than to use those very boundaries against us. ISAF's planning was therefore, and deployment was therefore on the basis of provincial metrics, not national metrics. And we soon realized that even this was too coarse, that the best basis for planning was the district, recognizing that societies engulfed in war and often undeveloped are usually very localized and very immobile. Finally, one thing jumps out of this report at me, and it was the subject of an important conference here in the college last year. And it's that we must recognize that more often than not in postmodern conflicts, violence, corruption, and organized criminality coexist. Not only do they coexist, but they form a nexus that seeks to maintain the violent status quo, to prolong it. Violence will enable smuggling, slave trading, drug dealing, arms trading, extortion, robbery, kidnapping, and murder, while these same activities fuel corruption and provide the means for violence to thrive. To return to where I began, the recognition of the causes of violence and the nature of the nexus should tell the practitioner and his boss, the policymaker, what the response may be, whether it is legal, judicial, and economic just as much as it is military. Our military doctrine and indeed international humanitarian law do not take this into account. And while it continues not to take it into account, this will haunt us and thwart our very best efforts.
Thank you very much.